They gave me the assignment at 600 on a Tuesday and told me to report to Compound 7 on the outer ring by 800. Standard protective detail, they said. A Velthoran diplomatic safe house. A succession hold ward, duration unknown. Report to the compound administrator on arrival and follow her lead on protocol. They didn't mention the ward was a child. They didn't mention the child would formally refuse my presence within the first 3 hours. If they had, I'm not sure it would have changed anything. The detail is the detail. That's something I learned early in my career and have never found a good reason to unlearn. Compound 7 was a transit-grade facility on Ketharuval's outer ring, the part of the station that the main corridors don't reach without a junction transfer, where the architecture is older, and the ceiling plates run lower, and the light comes through at angles that make everything feel like early morning regardless of the actual hour. It had been a shipping office once, then a processing annex, and the compact diplomatic service had converted it 7 years ago into what the official record called a Velthoran-compliant protective residence. What that meant in practice was that the interior walls had been fitted with pale gray fabric paneling instead of the standard station composite. The floor coverings were something woven in warm tones I didn't have names for, and there were 3 rooms off a central corridor furnished in ways I didn't have cultural language for: low frames, shallow shelving, curtain arrangements that divided space in the Velthoran domestic manner, which is about making a large space feel like it has several small ones, even when it doesn't. I walked the compound for the first time before anyone else arrived. 9 rooms, 3 primary residence rooms in the east wing, 2 administrative rooms off the central corridor, a common room with its window panel at the far end, a staff kitchen and a storage room behind it, Dov sales office at the north end, and the entry vestibule. 3 access points. The main entry from the outer ring corridor, a service door at the south end of the building, and the emergency egress at the east wing's exterior wall that was wired to the alarm system and hadn't been physically opened in at least 18 months based on the dust pattern around the frame. And 1 environmental maintenance corridor running parallel to the east wall, a passage I could not access from inside the compound, but whose access panel from the outer ring side was within 30 meters of the compound's east wall and outside the primary security sweep zone. That maintenance corridor was the first thing I noted in my report. Before I had met Dov Sale, before I had read the briefing document, before I knew anything about the ward's name or the succession dispute-specific details. I noted it because it was a covered approach to the compound's most exposed wall, and covered approaches to protected positions are what they are regardless of context. I noted the emergency egress dust pattern as the second item, and the service door's lock mechanism, which was keyed to the general ring maintenance credential rather than the compound-specific credential, as the third. I had filled 3 pages before anyone arrived. The compound administrator was a woman named Dov Sale. Compact service, 17 years, specialist in Velthoran diplomatic liaison. She was waiting in the entry corridor when I returned from my walk, and she handed me a 6-page briefing document before I had finished stating my name. "Read it now," she said. "The ward arrives in 4 hours. There are things you need to know before she does." I read it in her office, standing, because the chairs were the low Velthoran style, and I didn't want to get my posture wrong on the first day. The ward's name was Aelith. She was the second daughter of the Velthoran Ketzorath house, a succession house whose elder had died 8 months ago without completing a formal line designation. 2 competing claims had emerged from the surviving family branches, and the arbitration process had stalled. 3 weeks before I received the assignment, credible intelligence had placed an interdiction threat against the secondary heir, Aelith, from the opposing faction's enforcement arm. The assessment was specific and actionable. Moving her to a compact administered safe house on Ketharuval had been a diplomatic decision, made at the highest level of the liaison office, with the formal agreement of the house's surviving senior administrator. The briefing document had a section on cultural protocols. I read that section twice and then a third time. Velthoran succession hold wards of the second rank or above could not, under the house's own conduct codes, accept close proximity protection from male personnel not of the house or its approved affiliates. The provision wasn't new or unusual. It was embedded in the same framework as the ward's formal designation itself, the code that governed how she moved through the world during a succession dispute. The practical meaning was unambiguous. If the ward's appointed handler determined that my presence violated this provision, the handler had the right to formally object, and the diplomatic agreement that had brought Aelith to the compact facility required the compact to accommodate the objection. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the cultural protocols page. Dav Sale's handwriting, small and level. She will object. Run your watch from the outer corridor positions. The detail still matters. I folded the document and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went back to walk the compound a second time, paying particular attention to the outer corridor positions and what they could see. Aelith arrived at 1340, 20 minutes late. The delay was a documentation check at the ring's transit gate, standard procedure for a ward traveling under an active threat assessment, but it had still taken longer than projected. She came through the compound entry with her handler Kethsorn on her left, and a Velthoran house guard named Sevcoral on her right, and she walked the way I had learned to recognize in people who had been trained to walk a certain way from a very early age. Not stiff, controlled. There is a real difference. Stiff is what you see in someone who is afraid of looking afraid, bracing against the possibility of exposure. Controlled is what you see in someone who has been taught, before they had words for the teaching, that their bearing is a form of speech and every person who sees them is listening to it. Stiff breaks under pressure. Controlled is structural. It holds. She was small. The briefing document had given her approximate age, 9 in Velthoran developmental reckoning, and I had calibrated for that. But calibration and seeing are different. The training that sat on her body had been built for a body that would one day be considerably larger, and on a 9-year-old it had a particular quality. It was genuine, it was complete, but it also made her look like she was carrying something that had not yet been sized to fit. Silver gray skin, pale amber eyes, slightly deeper than her skin tone. Dark hair pulled back and secured in an arrangement I learned later was a house designation style. The way it was shaped and fastened carried meaning that I didn't have the vocabulary to read yet. She wore a deep blue traveling garment with trim at the collar and cuffs in a thread that caught the outer ring's indirect light in a way the base fabric didn't. She was carrying a small case herself rather than letting the house guard carry it, which I noticed. I was standing at the outer corridor position, the one Dav Sale had walked me to during our initial briefing, 40 meters from the entry, on the far side of the first internal door. I was there because the briefing document had established the outer corridor as my primary station, and because the handwritten note had reinforced it. Aelith's handler, Kethsorn, saw me before Aelith did. She was a woman in her late 40s, compact and precise, with the kind of stillness that comes from having spent decades in close protection work, the deep situational awareness that processes a room before the eyes have finished moving across it. She assessed me in the 2 seconds between seeing me and taking her next step, categorizing, measuring, arriving at a preliminary classification that she would revise if I gave her reason to. Then she said something brief in Velthoran to the house guard beside her. The guard's eyes moved to me. Then Kethsorn said something quieter to Aelith, close, low, a half-turn toward the ward's ear, and Aelith looked at me. Her expression did not change. That was the training. But she held the look for 2 full seconds, past what a casual glance would have required. Then she followed her handler past the first internal door, into the compound proper, and I was on the other side of it. The formal objection came 90 minutes later. Kethsorn delivered it to Dov Sale in writing, a single page in Velthorin formal register, the House provision cited by article and subsection and clause, the request for accommodation of the provision clearly stated and correctly framed. Dov Sale brought me a copy and a summary paragraph she had written herself. The provision applies explicitly to close proximity positions, Dov Sale said. The outer corridor posts are not covered by the explicit language. The objection is to interior corridor presence and anything within the close proximity threshold. How is close proximity defined? I asked. 12 meters in the formal register. Practical enforcement is 20. She paused. Your outer corridor position is 40. Understood, I said. The detail still matters, she said, and I recognized the handwritten note again, rephrased for the spoken form. I know, I said. She went back to her office. I went back to my post. The rhythm of Compound 7 established itself within the first week, and I mapped it the way I map any environment I'm responsible for, not just the physical structure, but the patterns of movement and presence that make the physical structure legible. Alith rose before the compound's standard waking hour. I knew this because I was at the outer corridor position before dawn each morning, and the compound's internal acoustic profile told me things without requiring visual confirmation. The particular sound of a door in the east wing opening, and then closing softly, a pause, then the light and deliberate pattern of steps that were neither Kethsorn's more purposeful gait nor Sevkoral's heavier one. She walked her own rooms in the early morning. I came to understand this as a habit from before, something she had done in whatever circumstances she lived in prior to the compound, carried forward into the new context the way habits survive disruption when they are deep enough. Kethsorn ran a structured day, and she ran it well. Language review in the morning. Alith was working on her formal compact standard register alongside her Velthorin court language, which meant she already had the academic compact that most educated Velthorin children learn, but was developing the specific inflectional patterns and register markers that distinguish formal from informal usage in diplomatic contexts. I knew this because I could sometimes hear the sessions from the outer corridor, not the content but the rhythm, and the rhythm of language review has a particular sound. Midday was studies, history, mathematics, something I couldn't identify until I saw the materials being brought in and recognized the spines of a multi-volume reference series on compact governance and treaty structure, which told me more about what kind of education Alith was receiving than the briefing document had. 3 afternoons a week there was a communication session, contact with a tutor on another station, conducted over a secure relay. The remaining afternoons were less structured. That was when she came to the common room with its window panel. The window looked out onto the outer ring's artificial light corridor, the long gallery of indirect lighting that runs the full circumference of the outer ring's inhabited level, the station's version of open sky. It was a modest view by any standard, a corridor of pale artificial light, the far wall of the ring's inner face, the ambient movement of service traffic. But it was what Compound 7 had, and she sat at the low table by the window panel 3 or 4 afternoons a week and looked at it. My outer corridor position had a sightline to that window from 40 meters. I wasn't watching it. I was watching the access points, which were what I was there to watch. But the outer ring's afternoon light simulation runs for 3 hours, and a window that is 20 meters outside your direct sightline is visible if it's in your peripheral field, and she was visible in it, the top of her head, and occasionally the notebook she was writing in. I noted it the same way I noted the maintenance access corridor, as information about the compound's occupancy pattern. What I did not note in any report, but noticed in the accounting I kept for myself, was the quality of the stillness she had at that window, Most people who sit near a window in a constrained environment are either looking at what's outside or actively not looking at it. The two postures are different, and you learn to read the difference when you spend enough time watching. Looking is open, receptive, the body turned slightly toward the glass. Actively not looking is a form of discipline, a withholding of attention from something that draws it, the body held deliberately neutral. Aelith did neither. She sat at the low table and looked at the outer ring's light corridor the way someone looks at something they are actually seeing, not consuming the view and not refusing it, but engaged with it in the specific way you're engaged with something that is telling you something rather than just displaying itself. The outer ring's artificial light simulation, the far wall of the ring, the ambient traffic of service carts and transit personnel. She was reading it the way she apparently read everything, for what it meant, not just what it showed. On the 11th day, Keth Sorn's morning language review session ran 40 minutes longer than its usual block, and when it ended, Aelith didn't go directly to the common room. She went to the East Wing instead and was there for nearly an hour. I tracked this through the acoustic profile, the particular quietness of the East Wing during that hour, and then the different quality of sound when she moved back through the corridor toward the common room. When she reached the window table, she sat for only a few minutes before writing something in the notebook, then set it down and looked at the light corridor without moving for the rest of the afternoon session. I stayed at my post. I ran my checks. I noted the variance in her routine as something to hold without acting on. On the 8th day, a service access request came through the outer ring's environmental maintenance system. The request was for the maintenance corridor that ran parallel to Compound 7's east wall, the one I had flagged on my first walk of the compound. The requesting contractor's credential code scanned as valid, but when I ran the name against the station's active roster manifest for the posted service date, the name didn't appear. It was a small discrepancy, the kind that reads as a data entry error, a mismatched field, a coding lag in the rostering system. The on-duty station security officer reviewed it in the queue and cleared it in 6 minutes. I watched the clearance come through on the duty terminal, and I wrote a supplementary report asking for a secondary physical verification, a confirmation that the person who had entered the maintenance corridor matched the credential they had presented. The request went to the station security office. 3 hours later, I received an automated acknowledgement noting that the case had been closed on initial review. I noted the acknowledgement. I noted that the East Wall Maintenance Access Panel was now accessible again until the next scheduled window. I increased my check frequency on that access point from the standard 2 per watch to 5. On the 14th day, Aelith came through the first internal door into the outer corridor. She was alone. Keth Sorn was not with her, which was unusual enough that I recalibrated my sense of the normal before she had reached her stopping point. She stopped at 8 meters, a distance I recognized as the outer edge of what a careful reading of the formal objections language might class as a close proximity threshold, if you interpreted the 20-meter practical enforcement measure conservatively and took the 12-meter formal definition as the operative one. She had done that calculation herself, or had it done for her. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on arrival day, 2 seconds, full assessment. Then she said, in compact standard with a formal inflection that was slightly more deliberate than native compact speakers use, the inflection of someone who knows the register and is choosing it precisely. You are always here. Yes, I said. She considered that as information. It seemed to confirm something she had already provisionally categorized, rather than tell her something new. Then she went back through the first internal door without saying anything else. I didn't move from my position. I didn't adjust my posture or my expression. I didn't call after her or note the exchange as significant in the duty log. I was at my post. She had come to the outer corridor and returned to the interior. That was the observation. Everything else I kept in my own accounting. She came back 4 more times over the following 10 days. Each time she stopped at the 8-meter threshold. Each time there was a brief exchange. The second visit, she asked how many access points the outer ring corridor had between the transit gate and compound 7's entry. I told her 9 and gave her their approximate locations in sequence from the gate. She wrote something in the notebook she was carrying. I didn't ask what. The third visit, she asked what I did when I wasn't at the outer corridor post. I told her. 6 hours of sleep, a review of my reports, meals at the Ring Junction cafeteria because Compound 7 staff kitchen wasn't provisioned for my shift schedule, and a secondary patrol of the outer ring's east-facing corridor that I ran between 100 and 200 each morning as a supplement to the primary check rotation. She wrote in the notebook again. The fourth visit was longer. She stood at her 8 meters and didn't say anything for nearly a full minute. I let the silence sit. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of someone working through a formulation before speaking it, which is a kind of respect for the conversation. Then she said, "Keth Zorn says it is not appropriate for you to be here." "The house provision covers close proximity positions," I said. "I'm at the outer corridor." "That is a technical reading of the provision," she said. "Yes," I said. "The intention of the provision is broader than the technical reading." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, why do you stay at the outer corridor if you know the technical reading is not the intention?" It was a precise question. I gave it a precise answer. "Because the provision and the detail exist for the same reason," I said. "They both exist to keep you safe. The provision does it one way, the detail does it another. In the current situation, both are necessary. I'm trying to honor both." She looked at me for a long moment. "And if Keth Zorn formally demands you move further?" "Then I'll move to whatever position still lets me do the job," I said. She wrote in the notebook. The fifth visit, she came to the threshold and said, "Why do you stay if you are not wanted?" Not the same question as before. The earlier question was about the technical accommodation. This one was the real question underneath it, the one that had been building since the first visit. She had been working toward it in sequence, the way someone who has been trained to proceed methodically proceeds through a problem. She wanted the direct answer, not the procedural one. "Because the detail is the detail," I said. "Who wants me here isn't part of my calculation." She stood there for a moment with that. Then, "That seems like an insufficient basis for staying where you are not welcome." "It's the only basis I need," I said. "Whether I'm welcome is a separate question from whether I'm needed. I stay because I'm needed." She looked at me with the 2-second assessment. For a fraction of that time, the controlled face was not perfectly controlled. It was barely a thing, a fraction of a second in which the composure held but the weight behind it was visible, the way a structural element under load is still standing, but you can see the stress in it if you know what to look for. Then she went back through the door. I stayed where I was. On the 22nd day, Keth Zorn came to the outer corridor herself. This was the first time she had come to me directly. She stood at a comfortable distance and assessed me with the same careful efficiency she had applied to everything I had seen her do, and when she spoke it was in compact standard, which she handled with a fluency that told me it was a working language for her, not a courtesy. "The ward asks about your reports," she said. I waited. "She has been asking about the East Wall access corridor. She says you check it more frequently than the other points." "I do," I said. "Why?" I told her. The service access request on day 8, the maintenance contractor whose name didn't match the active roster. The secondary verification I had requested and the automated closure I had received. The increase in my check frequency on that access point since then. All of it in the same order I had written it in the supplementary report. Keth Zorn was quiet while I spoke. She didn't interrupt. She didn't write anything down, which meant she was filing it without needing to, the kind of memory that protective work develops when you've been doing it long enough. I was not informed of the supplementary report, she said, when I had finished. It went to the station security office, I said, and was copied to Dov Sale. I will read it, she said, then Soren Vale. It was the first time she had used my name. In Velthorin formal practice, using someone's personal name in a professional exchange is a registration of their standing as a party to a matter, not an informality. I noted it. Yes, I said. The house provision is real, its purpose is real. She paused, measuring something she was about to say, but you are also real. She went back inside. That evening, Dov Sale told me that Kethsorn had filed a secondary verification request on the maintenance credential through the diplomatic liaison channel, which bypassed the general security queue. The station security office responded the following morning with a result that changed the shape of everything. The credential code that had been used on day 8 belonged to a maintenance contractor whose current active assignment was on the station's opposite ring. That contractor had not been near Compound 7's maintenance corridor on the day in question. The code had been duplicated, presented by someone else, using a valid credential that hadn't yet been flagged as compromised. The physical access had been granted before anyone checked whether the name matched the code. A person had entered the East Wall maintenance corridor. That person had not been the contractor whose credential they carried. Security opened a formal investigation. The maintenance window had already passed and been closed. But in sweeping the maintenance corridor, the investigation team found something that had been installed 6 days before I had filed my first report about the credential discrepancy. A microsensor array, mounted at a junction in the corridor's secondary conduit housing, oriented toward the compound's east wall. Small enough to miss in a visual sweep of the conduit housing unless you knew specifically what you were looking for. It had been recording the compound's internal access patterns and guard movement since before I had arrived. I read the security investigation report in Dov Sale's office the evening it came in, standing, the same way I had read the briefing document on the first day. They're mapping the interior, I said. Yes, Dov Sale said. They know the guard rotation. Yes. The Velthorin house guards follow the posted protocol, I said. Posted means documented, and the access pattern they've been recording for 6 days lets them verify the documentation against actual practice. If the posted protocol is what they've actually been doing, and there's no reason it wouldn't be, Sev Coral is a professional, then they know exactly where every guard in this compound will be during each hour of the rotation. Dov Sale said nothing. She was looking at me the way people look at someone when they've just said the thing that was already in the room but hadn't been spoken. The 3rd hour rotation, I said. That's when the interior coverage is thinnest, based on the protocol document. If I've read it correctly, the 3rd hour puts the primary guard positions at the entry and main corridor, with the east wing on a check-and-return pattern rather than a static post. You've read it correctly, she said. Then that's when they'll move, I said. She picked up her communication terminal. I went back to my outer corridor post and filed my second supplementary report. The 19 days that followed were tense in the particular way that a known threat with an unknown timeline makes everything tense. The surface holds. The light comes in at its outer ring angles. The compound runs its routines. And underneath every ordinary moment there is the awareness of a mechanism in motion that you can't see and can only partially predict. Security had found and removed the sensor array, but removing it had consequences. It told whoever had placed it that the array had been found. That compression was on the timeline. The investigation couldn't establish when the access breach was planned, but it had a narrowing window. I filed a 3rd report 14 days after the sensor array was removed. It said, as clearly as I could write it, that the third-hour rotation remained the primary vulnerability, that the posted protocol was known to the opposing faction, and that changing the protocol required authorization from the Velthorin House administrator, who was on another station, and that the authorization request had been submitted and was still processing. I received an acknowledgement. The protocol did not change. On the 35th day, Aelith came to the outer corridor at mid-morning, outside her usual pattern. She was carrying the notebook. She stopped at the threshold and looked at me. "You filed reports about the east wall," she said. "Yes," Kethsorn told me. I waited. "She didn't want to tell me," Aelith said. "I asked her to. I told her I needed the accurate version of what was being managed." That phrase, the accurate version. From an adult, it's a request for information, a preference for directness over management. From a 9-year-old who has been trained since before memory in the art of presenting a controlled face to the world, it is something else. It is the place where what she actually is shows through the training, the habit of mind that the training is trying to refine but hasn't replaced. She wanted to understand her situation. She wanted the facts, not the prepared version of the facts, and she had gone to the person she judged most likely to give them to her. "The reports are accurate," I said. "The response was not adequate," she said. It was not a complaint. It was an assessment, delivered in the same register she used for everything, flat, factual. The emotion folded into the precision of the language rather than separate from it. "No," I said, "it wasn't." She wrote something in the notebook, then she looked up. "I formally objected to your presence at this compound." "Yes." "I am not retracting the objection," she said, with a care that told me she had thought about how to say this specifically. "The provision is correct and its application here is correct, but I want you to know that I understand the reason for your position, and I understand that your position is not the same as dismissing the provision." "I know," I said. "I know that you know," she said, and then very briefly the 2-second assessment again. "That is why I am saying it." She went back through the door. I stayed at the outer corridor post and ran the rest of the watch. The breach came on the 41st night, at the 3rd hour. I was not at the outer corridor position. I had moved at 1:30, 2 hours before the third-hour rotation's most exposed window, to the east wall junction, the point in the inner perimeter where the maintenance corridor's external access panel met the compound's structural boundary. I had moved there because 3 reports had not changed the posted protocol, and I had decided that if the protocol wasn't going to adjust to the situation, I would adjust my position to cover the gap myself. I had not told Dov Sale. I had not filed a report and waited for approval. I had checked the pending authorization queue at 1:20. The request for the protocol amendment was still processing, and then I had moved to the east wall junction because it was the correct position for what I understood to be an imminent situation, and because I was the person who understood the situation, and because those 2 facts together made the decision something other than unauthorized. It was a judgment call. I made it. I want to be accurate about what I expected and didn't expect. I expected the breach attempt. I expected the 3rd-hour timing. I expected the east wall access point. What I had not been able to predict with precision was the number or their method of approach beyond the panel override I had assessed as likely. 4 is what there were. Velkoran separatist enforcement personnel, disciplined, purposeful, carrying a specific mandate rather than improvising, which made them more dangerous in one way and more predictable in another. They had an objective. They intended to reach it by the most direct available route. They did not expect me to be at the junction. The first one through the panel led with a scanning device, checking the corridor geometry before the others followed. He found me instead of an empty corridor, and the 4 minutes that followed were the 4 minutes that are in the formal security incident report, and which I won't reconstruct here beyond saying that none of them reached the east wing entry. When the station security response team arrived 11 minutes after the alarm, they found the corridor secured and me at the east wing door. I had a cut on my left forearm that needed closing. I didn't notice it until the security team's medic pointed to it. I was standing at the east wing door because the east wing door was the threshold. I stood at the threshold. That was the position. It wasn't complicated. It was the simplest possible version of the same calculation I had been running since day one. The Velthorin house guards had gone to their posted protocol positions when the breach alarm triggered, which placed them at the entry and main corridor. This was correct behavior. The posted protocol is the structure that holds a compound security together in the absence of real-time tactical assessment. Following it under pressure is professionalism, not failure. They were doing their job correctly. I was doing the job that my assessment of the specific situation required. The two things are not the same. Sometimes they align. Sometimes they don't. In this case they didn't, and the outcome was what it was. Dov Sale came to the East Wing corridor at 3:40. She had been in her office when the alarm triggered. I knew this because the alarm also reached her terminal, and she was the first compact administrative personnel to reach the corridor after the security response team, which meant she had moved as soon as the alert came in rather than waiting for confirmation of what it was. She had not stopped to gather anything. She came as she was, which told me something about how she thought about her responsibility to the compound and the ward. She looked at me standing at the East Wing door, my forearm closed and dressed by the response team's medic, my position unchanged since the security team had cleared the corridor. She was quiet for a moment in a way that told me she was processing the full scope of what had happened before she responded to any piece of it. The authorization for the protocol amendment came through at 200, she said. I know, I said. I checked the queue at 1:30 before I moved. She processed that. You moved 70 minutes before the authorization came through. Yes. A longer pause. The formal incident report will reflect that you repositioned in response to a credible and immediate threat assessment based on your prior filed analysis. That is an accurate characterization. Yes, I said, it is. It is also, she said carefully, the most favorable accurate characterization available. I know, I said. She went to find Keth Sorn. I stayed at the East Wing door. Keth Sorn came to the door at 4:10. She had been at the main corridor post during the breach, her protocol position, which was correct, and she had remained there until the security team's all clear. Now she came to the East Wing and stood outside the door and looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, in compact standard, very precisely, she did not leave the East Wing. A pause. She knew the breach alarm meant a physical access event. She assessed the direction of the alarm's primary trigger. She went to the interior side of the East Wing door and stayed there. I didn't say anything. She told me, Keth Sorn said, that you were on the other side of it. She said she could hear the security team's arrival. She waited until she heard the team's voice before she moved away from the door. I stayed at the East Wing door. Keth Sorn went back to her post. I stayed at the door until the full security reinforcement team arrived at 5:20 and the compound was formally secured under the amended protocol. Then I moved back to the outer corridor position and ran the rest of the watch. I filed my fourth supplementary report at 600. It was 2 paragraphs. The first confirmed that the East Wall Junction was now covered under the amended protocol. The second said, the threat was specific, the timing was as assessed, the outcome was the result of being in the correct position. No analysis, no argument, just the facts in order. The diplomatic aftermath took 3 weeks to resolve into something stable. The Velkoran faction's access breach was formally documented. The 4 enforcement personnel were in compact custody pending jurisdictional negotiation, and the Velthorin House administrator, A woman named Railvoreth Keth arrived on Ketharuval 6 days after the breach to conduct the house's own assessment of what had happened and what the compound's security posture should be going forward. She was in her late 50s, the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself because it has no need to. She spent 2 full days reviewing the compound's security documentation before she spoke to anyone on the compact side. Every report, every acknowledgement, the investigation record, the incident timeline. When she was ready to speak, she spoke to Dov Sale first and then she asked to speak to me, which Dov Sale conveyed as a request rather than a summons. I appreciated that. Railvoreth Keth reviewed my 3 reports in front of me, reading them the way people read documents they are taking seriously, not skimming, not performing attention, but actually reading. Then she asked me 3 questions about the maintenance credential discrepancy on day 8. I answered each one with the same words I had used in the report, because the report had been accurate. Then she said, "You repositioned to the east wall junction without authorization and without informing the duty officer." "Yes," I said. "The authorization was pending review." "Yes." "And you were aware it was pending?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you wait for it?" "Because the authorization pending and the authorization approved are different things," I said. "The threat I assessed was not in a pending state. It was specific, and it was on a timeline I estimated at hours, not days. Waiting for a queue to clear when the window is closing is a way of letting the process replace the judgment. In this case, that would have been the wrong substitution." She sat with that. Then she said something in Velthorin, and Keth Sorn, who was standing at the room's far wall, translated it without being asked. He understands the difference between the map and the ground. Railvoreth Keth said it the way someone says a thing they have been accumulating evidence for over a long period, and have finally found the example that confirms it. She issued a formal written commendation to the detail, which went into the compact personnel file. I read it once and filed it with the incident documentation. The language was precise and, in its own way, generous, not overstating what had happened, not minimizing the protocol deviation, but characterizing the whole in a way that held both things honestly. Someone had written it carefully. I suspected Keth Sorn had been consulted on the phrasing, and that Dov Sale had as well. The 3 of them had arrived at something that was true. Aelith left compound 18 days after the breach. The succession arbitration panel had reached a preliminary agreement that reclassified the threat assessment against the secondary heir from active to diminished, not resolved, not closed, but no longer at the level that required a compact safe house. She would return to Velthorin diplomatic housing with Keth Sorn and a full house-approved guard detail. If the assessment changed, the arrangement could be reinstated. For now she was going home, or as close to home as the succession dispute permitted. The departure preparation took 90 minutes. Keth Sorn managed it the way she managed everything, efficiently, quietly, with no wasted motion. The small case packed. The study materials organized into a document carrier. The rooms returned to the neutral state the compound's protocol required. I watched the activity from the outer corridor, which was where I was supposed to be. At 9:40, Aelith came through the first internal door into the outer corridor. She was ahead of Keth Sorn and Sev Coral. She was carrying the notebook. She stopped at 8 meters. The controlled face, the level chin, the bearing that sat on her like something that had been built for a larger version of her and was waiting for her to grow into it fully. She stood there for a moment and said nothing. I let the silence be what it was. Then she said, "You stayed." "Yes," I said. She looked at me with the assessment, 2 seconds. "The formal objection stands," she said. "I know." But she stopped. She looked at the notebook in her hands. There was something she was deciding about how to say a thing she had already decided to say, that particular stillness of someone selecting precision over convenience. Then she looked up at me, and for the length of one full breath, the composure held but its weight was visible. All of it. The 8 months of a succession dispute and an interdiction threat, and a compound on the outer ring of a station she hadn't chosen, and the provision she had correctly invoked, and the soldier who had stood at the outer corridor post anyway, and the night the east wing door had held. "I am glad you did not listen to it," she said. That was all she said. She turned and walked to the entry. Kethsorn came through the internal door a moment later and stopped. She looked at me with the full assessment she reserved for things that mattered, and then she gave me the Velthoran formal nod, the complete version, both register layers, the kind that in diplomatic contexts indicates an acknowledgement of a specific and significant act. I had learned enough by then to understand what it meant. Then she followed Aleph. The entry door closed. I stood at the outer corridor position until the watch ended at 1200. Then I wrote the final duty log entry, filed my transition report with the security office, and handed the compound back to Dav Sale. She shook my hand on the way out. Compact, standard grip, brief and direct. "Good work," she said. It was the whole of what she said, and it was the whole of what needed to be said. The succession dispute was resolved 11 months later. I read it in a compact diplomatic wire that came through the garrison news relay, brief and administrative, the way significant things are often recorded. The Keth-Zareth house had reached a formal settlement, the competing claim had been withdrawn, the succession was confirmed. The secondary heirs threat assessment was closed. I was on a different posting by then. A compact border garrison on Velkaran's northern approach sector, frontier assignment, similar category to what I'd done before, a different set of corridors and access points to walk and watch. Straightforward work. The kind of posting where the job is most of what there is, and that turns out to be enough. 3 months after the wire, a package arrived through the compact mail system, addressed to my name and posting. Return designation was a Velthoran house, address I recognized from the briefing documents I had read 14 months earlier, on the morning of my first day at Compound 7. Inside was the notebook. I set it on my desk and didn't open it for a while. I sat with it the way I sit with things I want to make sure I'm ready to receive accurately. When I opened it, most of it was what I had expected from what I had seen of it through the compound window and in her hands on the corridor threshold. Dense, dated, cross-referenced notes from her studies. The mathematical work in a notation style that mixed the formal Velthoran system with some modifications that were clearly her own. The language review entries, which tracked her compact register development with the systematic precision of someone who was monitoring her own progress as a data set. The history summaries, organized not chronologically but thematically, grouped by the type of situation rather than the date, which is not a standard method and suggests a particular kind of analytical habit. Near the back of the notebook, in a section that had otherwise been left blank, there were 9 entries. Each one had a date. Beside the date, a short line in Velthoran formal register. I checked the dates against my own records. Day 8, Day 14, Day 22. The 5 visits to the outer corridor threshold. The morning she had come to tell me she understood the reason for my position. The night of the breach, the departure morning. The breach entry read in my rough translation, he was at the door. The protocol placed him otherwise. He was at the door. The departure morning entry read, I said, I am glad you did not listen to it. He said nothing. He stayed at his position. He had always stayed at his position. This is what staying looks like when it is not a performance. That was the last entry. I closed the notebook and set it on my desk beside the garrison duty manifest. I left it there, in the stack of things I keep because they are true, not because they are useful. Because they are true, and some things deserve to be kept just for that reason. Some decisions don't have a cancellation condition. You make them once from the facts available, with a clear understanding of what you're responsible for, and after that they're just what you do. Not because someone approved them, not because someone wanted them, because the situation required them, and you were the one who understood the situation, and that combination doesn't leave you many options if you're honest about what you are. The watch runs, the door holds. She understood that before I ever said it to her. That's the whole of it.